For much of human history, there was one civilization that stood above the rest, in population, innovation, and sheer continuity. That civilization was China. Gunpowder, paper, the compass, printing. Long before the Industrial Revolution, China had already sparked its own revolutions in science, art, administration, and philosophy. While Europe was still fragmented and feudal, China had a meritocratic bureaucracy, a complex market economy, and vast cities linked by a web of roads, canals, and trade routes. Some historians believe it was poised to lead the world into modernity. So why didn't it? Instead, capitalism, the driving force behind the modern world, emerged in the unlikeliest of places, a divided and often chaotic Europe. From the ashes of feudalism, something radical took root: private enterprise, free markets, and industrial expansion. China had the tools. It had the knowledge. It had the scale. But not the spark. In this video we'll explore the deep historical forces, economic, political, cultural, even philosophical, that may have held China back. And we'll ask a question that rewrites the map of history. What if capitalism had been born in the East? Long before Europe emerged from its medieval darkness, China had already built a civilization of staggering complexity and scale. For nearly 2 millennia, it was the anchor of the Eastern world, not only in power but in ideas, innovation, and governance. By the time the Tang dynasty flourished in the 7th century, China had become a cultural and economic superpower. Chang'an, the imperial capital, was the largest city on earth, a melting pot of merchants, monks, poets, and diplomats from across Asia, the Middle East, and even the Mediterranean. Through the Silk Road, Chinese silk, porcelain, tea, and paper traveled to faraway empires. In return came gold, silver, horses, and philosophies. Trade wasn't just active, it was global. But it wasn't only land trade that defined Chinese prosperity. By the Song dynasty, in the 10th century, China had developed one of the most vibrant maritime economies in the world. Chinese ports handled ships from India, Arabia, and Southeast Asia. The Chinese economy was already so monetized that by the 11th century, the Song government introduced something revolutionary: paper money. This was over 600 years before paper currency was introduced in Europe. In fact, many of the things we associate with modern capitalism, financial instruments, long-distance trade, division of labor, were present in medieval China. Overseeing this vast empire was a bureaucracy unlike anything the world had ever seen. Civil servants weren't born into power, they earned it through rigorous exams based on Confucian texts. Merit, not birth, was the key to governance. This created a class of scholar officials who were deeply literate, rational, and trained to manage state affairs. It was technocracy before the term even existed. This centralized, stable system allowed China to project power and coordinate infrastructure across thousands of kilometers, from the Grand Canal to the Great Wall. Roads, irrigation, tax records, census data, all meticulously maintained. In the early 15th century, under the Ming dynasty, the world witnessed a truly astonishing feat: the voyages of Admiral Zheng He. Commanding a fleet of over 300 ships, some so massive they dwarfed anything in Europe, Zheng He sailed across the Indian Ocean, reaching India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. At its peak, China had the largest and most advanced navy in the world. It wasn't a question of could China explore and dominate overseas markets. It already had. With advanced agriculture, large-scale trade, organized finance, and a literate bureaucratic class, China had all the ingredients for what we now call capitalism. In fact, some scholars argue that had the Industrial Revolution not happened in Britain, it could have, and perhaps should have, happened in China. So the question lingers: if China had the tools, the people, the knowledge, and the ambition, why didn't it happen there first? To understand why capitalism didn't emerge in China, we first need to ask, what is capitalism really? Capitalism is more than just trade or money. Civilizations have traded for thousands of years. What sets capitalism apart is a unique combination of institutions and ideas. Private ownership of capital, competitive markets, wage labor, investment in profit-driven production, and, perhaps most importantly, the idea that economic growth is not just possible but desirable. It's a cycle of continuous expansion, fueled by innovation, risk-taking, and the pursuit of individual gain. Oddly enough, these ideas took root not in the great empires of the East, but in the fractured lands of medieval Europe. Why? Partly because of Europe's chaos. Unlike China's strong centralized government, Europe was divided into hundreds of competing kingdoms, principalities, and city-states. This political fragmentation encouraged economic experimentation. No single ruler could control everything. Merchants found space to grow. Cities became autonomous. Ideas, including radical ones, could spread and evolve. Competition wasn't just economic, it was also technological, military, and ideological. It created a race for advancement. So, what was missing in China? Despite its incredible sophistication, China's state was too powerful, too centralized, and too cautious. The Confucian worldview valued harmony, stability, tradition. Change was seen as a threat, not an opportunity. Wealth was often pursued through land and government service, not through private entrepreneurship. Merchants were often viewed with suspicion, ranked below scholars and farmers in the social hierarchy. Commerce existed, but it wasn't celebrated. And then there was the state. Chinese dynasties frequently intervened in markets, set prices, restricted internal migration, and controlled major industries like salt and iron. The state saw itself as the guardian of order, not a promoter of growth. Perhaps the most symbolic moment came in the 15th century, when after Zheng He's epic voyages, the Ming court abruptly halted maritime exploration. The massive ships were dismantled, the records were destroyed, and for centuries China turned inward. While Europe raced to the New World, founded joint stock companies, and ignited the Industrial Revolution, China stood still. It wasn't because China lacked genius or ambition. It was a matter of priorities and ideology. In Europe, profit became a virtue. In China, it remained suspect. In Europe, innovation was disruption. In China, it was disorder. And so, despite all the raw materials for capitalism being present in China, the spark never caught fire. The West accelerated into modernity, and China watched until the world would eventually come knocking. So why didn't capitalism emerge in China? A civilization with bustling cities, global trade, paper money, and a literate bureaucracy. A civilization that had, in many ways, already modernized, centuries ahead of Europe. Historians have been wrestling with this question for decades. And while there's no single answer, there are several compelling theories. Each offers a window into how different paths shape different futures. In the early 20th century, German sociologist Max Weber offered one of the most famous explanations. He believed that capitalism was born not just from economics, but from ethics, specifically the Protestant work ethic that emerged in Northern Europe. According to Weber, Protestantism encouraged thrift, hard work, individual responsibility, and, crucially, the reinvestment of profits. In this worldview, success in business wasn't sinful. It was a sign of divine favor. Compare this to China, where Confucianism had been the dominant moral and intellectual framework for over 2,000 years. Confucianism emphasized filial piety, obedience to hierarchy, harmony in society, and the importance of tradition. Change was viewed as disruptive. Profit was seen as potentially corrupting. Merchants were tolerated, but rarely admired. They occupied the bottom rung of the Confucian social order, below scholars, farmers, and artisans. Weber argued that without a cultural ethos that valued individual enterprise and constant growth, capitalism couldn't take root, no matter how advanced the society was. Another explanation looks not to ideas but to institutions. Specifically, the power of the Chinese state. Unlike Europe, where power was fragmented across dozens of kingdoms and principalities, China was a vast, unified empire. From the Qin dynasty onward, the Chinese imperial system was built to last, with a powerful central bureaucracy and a single emperor. This stability had enormous benefits: peace, infrastructure, public works, standardization. But it also meant that the state could easily control and limit economic experimentation. In China, all roads, literally and politically, led to the center. The emperor and his officials could freeze markets, issue bans, relocate populations, and nationalize industries with the stroke of a brush. In contrast, in early modern Europe, no single ruler could control the entire economy. If innovation was banned in France, it might thrive in Holland. If one city imposed high taxes, merchants could move their operations to the next. This decentralized structure, for all its chaos, allowed capitalism to evolve freely in the cracks between authority. China was a meritocracy, but only within very specific boundaries. The surest path to prestige, wealth, and power was not to open a business, but to pass the civil service exams and become a scholar official. These exams were brutally difficult, requiring years of classical study. But for those who succeeded, it meant influence, honor, and a role in the imperial machine. In this world, intellect was valued, but only in the service of the state. Meanwhile, the merchant class, despite their wealth, was often politically marginalized and culturally dismissed. In Europe, the merchant class would become the middle class, the engine of capitalism. In China, they were often kept at arm's length from power. So over time, talent and ambition were funneled into maintaining the system, not challenging or transforming it. There's also the theory that geography and necessity played a critical role. By the 18th century, Britain faced a unique set of pressures: limited farmland, rising population, and declining forests. To survive, it had to innovate, and fast. Enter coal. Britain had abundant coal close to its industrial centers. It was dirty, dangerous, and transformative. Meanwhile, China also had coal, but it was often far from economic centers, hard to extract, or simply not needed. China's agricultural productivity was high, and internal trade was efficient. The pressure to mechanize was lower. Where Europe had to change to survive, China could continue with what already worked. One of the most symbolic moments in this story came in 1433, when the Ming court ordered the end of all naval expeditions. Admiral Zheng He's fleet, which had once reached Africa, was dismantled. The great shipyards fell silent. China turned inward. Why? Because the court saw little value in foreign trade. They feared the growing power of merchants and eunuchs. And they believed, with some justification, that everything of value already existed within China. While Europe opened up the world, China, intentionally, stepped away from it. None of these theories, on their own, fully explain why capitalism didn't emerge in China. But together, they point to a fundamental difference. China was a civilization built on order, tradition, and balance. It was designed to last, not to disrupt. Europe, by contrast, became a continent of disruption. Or reformation. Revolution. It was messy, but in that mess, capitalism found space to grow. The real irony? The very strengths that made China so advanced, its unity, its philosophy, its bureaucracy, may have also held it back from the capitalist leap. For centuries, China stood as a self-contained world. A civilization so vast, so self-assured, it called itself the Middle Kingdom, the center of everything. Europe, in contrast, had grown restless. Capitalism had transformed its cities. The Industrial Revolution was speeding up history. Coal-powered factories, railroads, steamships, and with them, a hunger for markets and resources. Inevitably, these two worlds would collide. In the early 19th century, Britain faced a trade imbalance with China. British demand for Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk was enormous. But China wanted little in return. To fix the imbalance, the British turned to something far more profitable and destructive: opium. When Chinese officials cracked down on the drug trade, Britain responded not with diplomacy, but with gunboats. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was a shock. The Qing Empire, once so dominant, was humiliated by a smaller, industrialized power. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to open ports, pay indemnities, and cede Hong Kong. It was the beginning of what Chinese historians call the century of humiliation. As the West embraced capitalism and industry, it reshaped the globe: colonies, corporations, railroads, banks, revolutions. China, for all its past brilliance, was left behind, not because it lacked intelligence or strength, but because the rules had changed. Each encounter with the industrial West exposed the cracks in the old system. The Taiping Rebellion, sparked in part by internal crisis and foreign pressure, would kill tens of millions. Other rebellions followed. The dynasty weakened. By the late 19th century, foreign powers were carving spheres of influence inside China. Railroads, ports, industries, controlled not by the Chinese state but by outsiders. China, once the world's largest economy, was now being dictated to economically, politically, and militarily. Factories were built not by Chinese entrepreneurs, but under foreign capital. Trade routes served foreign interests. The imperial court struggled to modernize, but too slowly, too cautiously. In a capitalist world, China had no leverage, because it hadn't written the rules of the game. The consequences weren't just economic. They were existential. In 1911, the last emperor of China abdicated. The dynasty collapsed. The imperial world, shaped by Confucian ideals, stable order, and scholar rule, was gone. In its place, revolutions, warlords, ideologies, experiments. China would spend the next century struggling to redefine itself, often by turning to the very capitalist and industrial models it once resisted. The question of why capitalism didn't start in China isn't just a story about the past, it shaped the entire modern world. Because in the end, China didn't escape capitalism. It encountered it from the outside, as an empire facing gunboats, contracts, and a future it hadn't chosen. History isn't just a record of what happened. It's a record of choices, circumstances, and missed turns. So let's imagine a different path. What if capitalism had taken root in China first? What if the engines of industry, global finance, and modern power had all been born not in Manchester, but in Hangzhou? Let's say the Chinese imperial court had embraced maritime expansion in the 1400s, encouraged merchant innovation, and allowed private enterprise to flourish. Zheng He's voyages continue, not as imperial displays but as commercial missions. Chinese merchants set up permanent colonies in Africa, India, and Arabia. The Indian Ocean becomes a Chinese lake. By the 1600s, Chinese inventors and entrepreneurs begin mechanizing silk production, watermills, and ironworks. The Yangtze River becomes the world's first industrial corridor. While Europe remains fragmented by war and aristocratic power, China becomes the world's first industrial superpower, trading not spices but steam engines. But Chinese capitalism wouldn't look like Western capitalism. It might have evolved under the principles of Confucian harmony, emphasizing long-term stability over short-term profit, family businesses over stock markets, and public order over radical individualism. Imagine corporations run like extended clans, accountable not just to shareholders but to ancestral obligations. Labor relations shaped by filial duty, not adversarial contracts. This model might have slowed the pace of exploitation, or simply created different kinds of inequality. But it would have challenged the idea that capitalism has to look like it did in the West. If China had led the capitalist revolution, the global balance of power would have looked completely different. European colonies? Maybe not. Perhaps it's Europe being carved up into spheres of influence by Chinese powers. Perhaps New York is a Chinese-speaking port. London imports porcelain. African states ally with Chinese banks instead of European powers. And the modern world? Smartphones might have Confucian ethics apps pre-installed. AI might be optimized for social harmony, not personal convenience. The dominant global language? Mandarin. The dominant political philosophy? Something far more ancient than liberalism or Marxism. But here's the twist, maybe this alternate history was never possible. Maybe the same values that made China stable for 2,000 years, Confucian order, bureaucratic excellence, cultural continuity, were the very things that made disruptive change so unlikely. Maybe capitalism had to emerge from the margins, from a continent full of chaos, war, and ambition. Maybe China chose something else, until the world forced its hand. Alternate histories show us what could have been. But they also remind us what was and what that cost, or protected. History is a mirror, and sometimes, a map of roads not taken. History isn't a straight line. It bends. It doubles back. It folds over itself. We often tell it as a story of progress, from old to new, east to west, feudal to capitalist. But in truth, it's a story of choices, structures, and timing. China didn't fail to invent capitalism. It simply followed a different logic, one built on stability, unity, and harmony over disruption. The West embraced change, competition, and growth, but it also paid the price in war, inequality, and empire. Ironically, China is now one of the world's largest capitalist economies, without ever fully adopting the Western model. Markets coexist with state control. Billionaires exist beside communist slogans. Global trade flows through a system still rooted in ancient ideas of order. This contradiction, or synthesis, is not a failure of history. It's what happens when a civilization adapts on its own terms. China didn't miss the capitalist train. It caught a different one, and now in many ways it's driving. We often ask, why didn't China develop like Europe? But maybe the better question is, why did Europe develop like it did? What if capitalism was a historical anomaly, not a universal endpoint, but a particular result of a particular place at a particular time? And what happens next in a world where that model is no longer alone? History is full of paths not taken. But the road we're on now, with its power, its tensions, its contradictions, was shaped not just by what was but by what wasn't. And if we want to understand the future, we need to start by asking better questions about the past. This was Alternative History. If you enjoyed the journey, subscribe and join us on the next one.